The dust had come out of nowhere, billowing across the Utah plains like an angry ocean wave, and Madeline Nash knew she was in serious trouble. Her horse spooked, rearing back so violently that she tumbled from the saddle onto the hard, packed earth. By the time she'd gathered her wits, the animal was gone, disappeared into the swirling brown cloud that now surrounded her completely. It was 1873, and Madeline realized with growing dread that she was alone on foot and at least 15 miles from Provo. Madeline pulled her shawl over her nose and mouth, squinting against the stinging particles that seemed determined to scrub the skin from her bones. She'd been visiting her ailing aunt in Salt Lake City and had foolishly decided to make the journey back to Provo alone, despite warnings about changing weather. The clear morning sky had deceived her, and now she was paying the price for her stubbornness. "Keep walking," she muttered to herself, her voice muffled by the cloth. "Just keep walking." But which direction was Provo? The sun was completely obscured and the familiar landmarks had vanished in the brown haze. Panic began to rise in her chest as she realized she could be walking in circles or worse, heading farther into the wilderness. Hours passed. Her water canteen, which had been half full at the start of her journey, was now empty. Her throat felt as though she'd swallowed sandpaper, and her lips were cracked and bleeding. The fine dust had worked its way into her clothing, her hair, her eyes, and every breath brought more of it into her lungs. Madeline stumbled, fell to her knees, and for a moment considered giving up. "Miss." "Hey, miss." At first, she thought she was hallucinating. The male voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere in the howling wind. Then a dark shape materialized in the dust, a horse and rider. "Can you stand?" The man's voice was closer now. Madeline looked up to see a tall figure dismounting, his face obscured by a bandana. "I think so," she croaked, though her legs felt like water as she attempted to rise. Strong hands gripped her elbows, steadying her. "You're a long way from anywhere," the man said. "What in God's name are you doing out here in this blow, my horse?" She began, but dissolved into a fit of coughing. The stranger reached for something at his saddle and pressed a canteen into her hands. "Drink," he ordered. "Slow now." The water was warm and tasted slightly metallic, but it was the most wonderful thing Madeline had ever experienced. She had to force herself to sip slowly as the man had instructed. "Thank you," she managed after a moment. "I'm Madeline Nash. I was traveling to Provo when the storm hit." The man lowered his bandana briefly, revealing a sun-weathered face, keen blue eyes, and a square jaw darkened with stubble. "Yates Vickers," he replied. "Ranch hand at the Double Cross, 'bout 3 miles from here." He glanced at the sky, though there was nothing to see but swirling dust. "This ain't letting up any time soon. Can you ride?" Madeline nodded, though in truth she wasn't entirely sure. "Good," Yates said, helping her toward his horse. "We'll head for the line shack. It's closer than the main ranch house." With a strength that surprised her, he boosted her into the saddle before swinging up behind her. One arm circled her waist, holding her steady as he took the reins with his free hand. Madeline was acutely aware of the solid warmth of his chest against her back, the only comforting thing in a world gone mad with dust and wind. "Hang on," he murmured near her ear, and they set off at a careful pace through the storm. Madeline tried to stay alert, but exhaustion pulled at her. The rhythmic motion of the horse, combined with the steady presence of the man behind her, lulled her into a state somewhere between consciousness and sleep. She wasn't sure how much time had passed when they finally stopped. "We're here," Yates announced, dismounting and helping her down. Through the dust, she could just make out the shape of a small cabin. Yates led his horse to a lean-to shelter attached to one side, then guided Madeline to the door. Inside, The air was still dusty, the fine particles found their way through every crack and crevice, but it was a vast improvement from the maelstrom outside. The cabin was spare, but tidy. A single room with a small cast iron stove, a narrow bed in one corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and shelves stocked with supplies. Yates quickly lit a lamp, then set about starting a fire in the stove. "You should take those outer clothes off," he said matter-of-factly. "They're caked with dust." Madeline hesitated, and Yates must have sensed her discomfort. "I'll step outside to check on my horse," he added. "There's a blanket on the bed you can wrap up in. I'll knock before I come back." Once alone, Madeline peeled off her dust-laden dress and petticoat, shaking them out as best she could before draping them over a chair. She kept her chemise on but wrapped the rough wool blanket around her shoulders. The simple act of removing the gritty clothing was a relief she hadn't anticipated. True to his word, Yates knocked before re-entering. He carried a bucket of water he'd apparently drawn from a well. "It's not much, but you can wash up a bit," he said, setting it on the table. He busied himself at the stove, his back to her as she gratefully sponged the worst of the dust from her face, neck, and hands. "Are you hungry?" he asked, still not turning. "Starving," she admitted. Yates produced a can of beans, some jerky, and hardtack from the supplies. "Ain't exactly fine dining," he apologized. "It looks wonderful," Madeline said sincerely. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Madeline studied her rescuer in the lamplight. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 27 or 28 to her 22 years. His hands were calloused but clean, his movements efficient and deliberate. There was an air of quiet capability about him that she found reassuring. "Thank you," she said softly, "for finding me, for the water, for everything." Yates looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time since they'd entered the cabin. Something flickered in his gaze, concern, perhaps, or something warmer. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Madeline shook her head. "Not everyone would have been out in that storm in the first place. Not everyone would have seen me. Not everyone would have shared their water when they didn't know how long they'd be stranded." A flush crept up his neck, visible even in the dim light. "Well," he said gruffly, "you'd have done the same, I expect." Madeline smiled. "I'd like to think so." After they'd eaten, Yates insisted she take the bed. "I've slept on harder floors than this," he said when she protested. He made himself a pallet with his saddle, blanket, and coat. Despite her exhaustion, Madeline found sleep elusive. The wind continued to howl around the cabin, and every so often a particularly strong gust would send a new shower of dust through the cracks. She could hear Yates breathing steadily across the room and wondered if he was asleep. "Mr. Vickers," she ventured after a while. "Just Yates," came the reply. He wasn't asleep either. "Yates. How long do these storms usually last?" There was a pause. "Hard to say. Could blow itself out by morning, could go on for days." Madeline absorbed this. "People will be worried about me in Provo, my brother Marcus especially." "First chance we get, we'll get word to town," Yates assured her. "But there's nothing to be done tonight except wait it out." She knew he was right, but anxiety still gnawed at her. "I've never been caught in a dust storm before," she admitted. "I was so frightened." "You did well," Yates said quietly. "Most folks would have panicked completely. You kept your head." His approval warmed her more than it should have. "What were you doing out there?" she asked. "Checking fence lines. It's part of my job. Lucky thing too, or we might never have crossed paths." Lucky indeed, Madeline thought as she finally drifted toward sleep. Her last conscious thought was that despite the circumstances, there was something comforting about sharing this small space with the quiet cowboy who had appeared like a miracle in the dust. Morning brought little improvement. The storm had not abated. If anything, it seemed to have intensified. Yates was already up when Madeline awoke, heating coffee on the stove. "I was hoping to see sunshine," she said, sitting up and keeping the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Yates shook his head. "No such luck." "But I've seen worse. This will pass eventually." He offered her a cup of the strong, black coffee, and she accepted gratefully, though she usually took hers with cream and sugar. The hot liquid helped clear the dust from her throat. "I need to check on my horse and bring in more water," Yates said. "Your clothes are still pretty gritty. There's a spare shirt and trousers in that trunk if you want something cleaner." Madeline hesitated at the impropriety, but practicality won out. After Yates went outside, she investigated the trunk and found the clothing he'd mentioned. The cotton shirt was soft from many washings, and though the trousers were far too large, she managed to make them stay up by tightening the belt as far as it would go. She felt ridiculous but much more comfortable. When Yates returned, his eyebrows rose slightly at her appearance, but he made no comment. He set about making a simple breakfast of bacon and more hardtack. The day stretched before them, empty of anything but waiting. "Tell me about yourself," Madeline suggested as they ate. "How long have you worked at the Double Cross?" "Going on 5 years now," Yates replied. "Started as just a hand, worked my way up to foreman last year." "That's impressive. You must be good at what you do." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I work hard." "The ranch owner, Mr. Hollister, is fair, pays better than most." "And before that," Madeline prompted. Something closed in Yates's expression. "Moved around, worked cattle drives mostly." She sensed there was more to his story, but he clearly didn't want to elaborate. "My father was a rancher," she offered instead. "Not a big spread like the Double Cross sounds to be, but we did all right. He died 2 years ago. My brother runs things now." "I'm sorry about your father," Yates said, and she could tell he meant it. "Thank you. It was hard, but we've managed. Marcus is good with the business side of ranching, and I help with the books." She smiled slightly. "And try to stay out of trouble, though I haven't been very successful at that lately." That earned her a small smile in return. Trouble has a way of finding even the most cautious folks sometimes. As the day wore on, they fell into an easy rhythm. Yates taught her how to play poker using a dog-eared deck of cards he found in a drawer. They talked about books. They'd read. She was surprised to discover he was well-read despite his obvious lack of formal education, and swapped stories about life in the territory. Yates went out periodically to check on his horse and the weather. Each time he returned, Madeline felt a rush of relief that seemed disproportionate to the short separation. There was something about this man that intrigued her. He was different from the men she knew in Provo, quieter, more self-contained. Yet there was a depth to him that hinted at experiences beyond her own limited world. By evening, they'd grown comfortable enough with each other that silence no longer felt awkward. Madeline helped prepare another simple meal, and they ate by lamplight as the wind continued its assault on the small cabin. "Tell me about Provo," Yates said unexpectedly. "What's it like living there?" Madeline considered the question. "It's growing quickly." "Not as big as Salt Lake City, of course, but busy. There's the Mormon Tabernacle, and Brigham Young Academy was established a few years ago." She smiled. "It's civilized, I suppose you could say. Church on Sundays, socials, and dances. Everyone knows everyone else's business." "Sounds nice," Yates said, though his tone suggested he might find such a life stifling. "It can be," she acknowledged. "Though sometimes I wonder what it would be like to just go somewhere, see something new." She laughed self-consciously. "I suppose that's what I was doing when I got caught in this mess." Yates studied her with those keen blue eyes. "Nothing wrong with wanting to see more of the world, Miss Nash." "Madeline," she corrected. "If I'm calling you Yates, you should call me Madeline." He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Madeline, then. The way he said her name with a slight drawl that softened the syllables sent an unexpected shiver through her. To hide her reaction, she stood and began clearing away their dinner things. That night, as she lay in the narrow bed listening to the storm and Yates's steady breathing from his pallet on the floor, Madeline realized that despite the circumstances, she wasn't anxious to return to Provo just yet. The thought was unsettling enough that it took her a long time to fall asleep. The next morning brought a subtle change. The wind had lessened somewhat, though dust still swirled in the air. "Might be starting to blow itself out," Yates observed as he returned from checking his horse. "Still not safe to travel, but it's a good sign." Madeline felt a curious mix of relief and disappointment. "How long once it stops before we can head for town? Takes a while for the dust to settle, and we'll need to wait for better visibility to find our way." He paused. "But if it clears enough, I might be able to make it to the main ranch house. Let them know where I am, and they could send word to your brother in Provo." She nodded, knowing this was the sensible course of action. "Of course." They passed the morning playing more cards and talking. Yates told her about a cattle drive he'd been on from Texas to Kansas, painting such a vivid picture of life on the trail that Madeline could almost see the endless herds of longhorns, feel the bone-deep weariness, taste the perpetual dust. "It sounds awful," she said, laughing. "Why would anyone choose to do that?" Yates's expression grew thoughtful. "There's a freedom to it, just you and the herd and the sky. No fences, no buildings, nothing holding you down." He glanced around the cabin. "Not that I mind being settled now. But there was something about those years that I wouldn't trade." Madeline tried to imagine such a life, and couldn't quite manage it. Her existence had always been circumscribed by the expectations of her family and community. Even her current adventure, as terrifying as it had been, would soon become just an anecdote, a brief departure from the orderly progression of her life. "What about you?" Yates asked. "What's next for Madeline Nash once she gets back to Provo?" The question caught her off guard. "I haven't really thought about it. Helping my brother with the ranch, I suppose. Maybe marriage eventually if the right man comes along." It sounded flat even to her own ears. "Is that what you want?" No one had ever asked her that before. "It's what's expected," she replied carefully. Yates nodded as if he understood perfectly. "Expectations are heavy things to carry." They lapsed into silence, but it was comfortable rather than strained. Later, Yates taught her how to make biscuits using the limited supplies available in the cabin. They turned out lumpy and slightly overdone, but Madeline felt an absurd pride in the accomplishment. "Not bad for your first try," Yates said, biting into one. "Better than my first batch, anyway. You learned to cook on cattle drives?" she asked. He nodded. "Cookie would have walloped me if I'd produced these, but he taught me enough to get by." The day slipped away in such simple exchanges. By evening, the wind had definitely decreased, though fine dust still filtered through the air. "Tomorrow might be clear enough to make it to the ranch house," Yates said as they prepared for another night in the small cabin. "That's good news," Madeline replied automatically, though she felt a pang at the thought of their time together ending. That night, she found sleep even more elusive. From his breathing, she could tell Yates was awake too. Finally, she spoke into the darkness. "Yates?" "Yes, thank you for these days, despite everything they've been special." There was a long pause before he replied, his voice low and rough. "For me too, Madeline." Something in the way he said it made her heart beat faster. She wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. Eventually, she drifted into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of dust and blue eyes. Dawn brought clear skies for the first time in days. The air was still dusty, but the suffocating storm had passed. Madeline stood in the doorway of the cabin, breathing deeply and squinting in the brightness. "Looks like we made it through," Yates said, coming to stand beside her. "Yes," she agreed, turning to look at him. In the clear morning light, she noticed details she'd missed before: the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, a small scar at his temple, the way one corner of his mouth lifted slightly higher than the other when he smiled. "I'll ride to the ranch house today," he said. "Get word to Provo about you. Mr. Hollister will probably send a wagon to take you to town." "How far is Provo from here?" she asked. "About 20 miles. The double cross is halfway between here and there." 20 miles. In a few hours she would be back in her familiar world, and this interlude would be over. The thought left her feeling strangely empty. "I should get ready," she said, turning back into the cabin. Yates followed. "You can keep wearing those clothes for the ride if you want. Your dress is still pretty dusty." Madeline nodded, grateful for the practicality of trousers for horseback riding, even if she'd have to change before anyone in Provo saw her. They shared a quick breakfast, neither saying much. Then Yates saddled his horse while Madeline gathered her few belongings. "Ready?" he asked when she emerged from the cabin. "Yes," she said, though she wasn't at all sure that was true. The ride to the ranch house took about an hour. The landscape was transformed by the storm. Drifts of dust had created new contours, and some familiar landmarks were obscured. But Yates navigated confidently, and soon a cluster of buildings appeared on the horizon. The double cross was larger than Madeline had imagined: a substantial main house, bunkhouse, barn, and several outbuildings. As they approached, a man emerged from the barn, shading his eyes against the sun. "Yates," he called, "thought the dust might have carried you off." "Nearly did, Tom," Yates replied as they drew closer. "This is Miss Nash. She got caught in the storm on her way to Provo. Her horse bolted." Tom touched his hat respectfully. "Madam, lucky Yates found you. Those dust blows can be deadly." "I'm very grateful," Madeline said. More ranch hands appeared, curious about the unexpected visitor. Yates helped Madeline dismount, his hands lingering at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. "I'll go speak to Mr. Hollister," he said quietly. "See about getting you home." She nodded, suddenly feeling out of place in the borrowed clothes, surrounded by curious glances. One of the ranch wives, introduced as Mrs. Simmons, kindly took Madeline to the cookhouse for coffee while Yates went to find the ranch owner. "You poor thing, Mrs. Simmons clucked, pouring her a cup. "Caught out in that terrible storm, and staying in that lined shack with just Yates for company." There was a question in her eyes that she was too polite to voice directly. "Mr. Vickers was a perfect gentleman," Madeline assured her, feeling her cheeks warm. "I would have died out there if he hadn't found me." Mrs. Simmons nodded approvingly. "Yates is a good man, quiet, keeps to himself mostly, but solid. Mr. Hollister relies on him more than anyone." Madeline sipped her coffee, oddly pleased by this confirmation of her own assessment of Yates. It wasn't long before Yates returned with an older man she presumed was Mr. Hollister. The ranch owner was gruff but kindly, expressing concern about her ordeal and immediately offering to send her to Provo. "I'll have Tom hitch up the wagon," he said. "You can be in town by mid-afternoon." "Thank you," Madeline said, though her heart sank at how quickly events were moving. "I'll ride along," Yates said unexpectedly. "Make sure Miss Nash gets home safely." Mr. Hollister raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Fine. You've earned a day or two off after that storm anyway." While the wagon was being prepared, Mrs. Simmons found Madeline a dress to borrow, slightly large but far more appropriate for arriving in town than Yates's spare clothes. She changed quickly, aware that time was slipping away. When she emerged from the house, the wagon was waiting, with Yates already seated, holding the reins. He'd cleaned up as well, she noticed, and had put on a fresh shirt. Their eyes met as she approached, and something unspoken passed between them. The journey to Provo was both too long and too short. The wagon jostled over the rough road, sometimes forcing Madeline to brace herself against Yates to avoid being thrown about. Each casual contact sent awareness skittering through her. They talked sporadically about the ranch, about the storm, about inconsequential things, but there was a tension now that hadn't existed in the isolation of the line shack. Too soon, the outskirts of Provo came into view. "Where should I take you?" Yates asked, his voice carefully neutral. "My brother's house is on the north edge of town," Madeline directed him. "The white one with the red barn behind it." As they entered town, Madeline became acutely conscious of the curious glances directed their way. Provo wasn't so large that a stranger wouldn't be noticed, and she realized how it must look her returning after days of absence in the company of an unknown man. Gossip would be inevitable. They pulled up in front of Marcus's house, and before Yates could even help her down, the front door flew open. Her brother rushed out, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "Maddie," he exclaimed, lifting her from the wagon and enveloping her in a bear hug. "My God, we've been worried sick." "I was about to organize a search party when the dust finally cleared." "I'm fine, Marcus," she assured him, returning his embrace. "Thanks to Mr. Vickers here." Marcus turned to Yates, who had dismounted and was standing awkwardly beside the wagon. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you, no need," Yates interrupted. "Anyone would have done the same." "Nonsense," Marcus insisted, pumping Yates's hand. "You saved my sister's life. Please come inside. You must be hungry and tired after your journey." Madeline held her breath, hoping Yates would accept. For a moment he seemed about to refuse, but then his eyes met hers and he nodded. "Much obliged." Inside, Marcus's wife Sophia fussed over Madeline, insisting she sit while she prepared tea and food. Their two young children, Thomas and Emma, clamored for their aunt's attention, delighted by her unexpected return. "Now tell us everything," Marcus said once they were settled in the parlor. "What happened to your horse? How did you get caught in that storm?" Madeline recounted the events of the past days, conscious of editing certain details, the way Yates had held her on the ride to the cabin, the borrowed clothes, the conversations that had seemed so intimate in the small space they'd shared. Even with these omissions, the story painted a clear picture of her debt to the quiet cowboy who now sat uncomfortably on Sophia's best settee. "You're a hero, Mr. Vickers," Sophia declared when Madeline finished her tale. Yates shook his head. "Just did what needed doing, madam." "Well, you must stay for dinner at least," Marcus insisted. "And the night, too. It's getting late, and you shouldn't have to ride back to your ranch in the dark." Madeline's heart leapt at the prospect of a few more hours in Yates's company, but he was already shaking his head. "Thank you, but I should get back. Mr. Hollister will be expecting me." "At least stay for dinner," Madeline found herself saying, more forcefully than she'd intended. Yates looked at her and something in his expression softened. "All right, dinner would be welcome." The evening meal was pleasant, with conversation flowing easily. Yates gradually relaxed, even sharing a few stories about ranch life that had the children giggling. Watching him interact with her family, Madeline felt a growing warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with Sophia's excellent cooking. All too soon, dinner was over, and Yates was making noises about leaving. Marcus tried once more to convince him to stay the night, but Yates was politely firm. "I'll walk you out," Madeline said as he prepared to depart. Outside, the evening was cool and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. They stopped beside the wagon, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "Thank you again," Madeline said softly, "for everything." Yates nodded, his eyes on hers. It was my pleasure, Madeline. The way he said her name still sent that same shiver through her. Impulsively, she reached out and touched his arm. Will I see you again? The question hung between them, laden with meaning. Yates glanced back at the house, then at her. I don't know, he said honestly. Our worlds are pretty different. They don't have to be, she whispered. For a moment he seemed about to say more, but then he stepped back slightly. I should go. It's getting dark. Madeline nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. Of course. Safe journey, Yates. He climbed into the wagon, gathered the reins, then paused. I come into town sometimes for supplies. The general store on Main Street, she said quickly. I help there on Tuesdays and Thursdays. A small smile touched his lips. Good to know. With a nod, he flicked the reins and the wagon began to move. Madeline stood watching until it disappeared down the road, her mind already counting the days until Tuesday. The next few days passed in a haze of normalcy that felt strangely unreal. Madeline answered endless questions about her ordeal, accepted concerned visitors, and tried to slip back into her routine. But everything felt different now. The familiar streets of Provo seemed confining after the vast openness of the plains. The comfortable rhythms of her life felt like a costume that no longer quite fit. Tuesday couldn't come quickly enough. Madeline rose early, taking extra care with her appearance before heading to the general store. All morning, she found herself glancing up every time the bell over the door jingled, her heart racing and then sinking when it wasn't Yates. By closing time, he still hadn't appeared, and Madeline walked home with a heaviness in her chest that she tried to ignore. Thursday brought the same ritual, the same anticipation, the same disappointment. And the following Tuesday and Thursday as well. A month passed with no sign of Yates Vickers. You seem distracted lately, Marcus commented one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner. Is everything all right? Madeline forced a smile. Just restless, I suppose, after the adventure with the dust storm. Marcus studied her thoughtfully. You know, Maddie, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time you had a change. Cousin Elizabeth has been writing from Denver saying how much she'd love a visit. The suggestion took her by surprise. Denver? But what about the store? And helping you with the ranch accounts? We can manage without you for a while, Marcus said gently. Mighty you good to see somewhere new. Madeline considered it. Denver was a larger city, with more opportunities, more experiences to be had. But it wasn't what or who she was longing for. I'll think about it, she promised. The next day at the store, Madeline was organizing a new shipment of dry goods when the bell jingled. She looked up automatically, then froze. Yates stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking as uncertain as she'd ever seen him. Hello, Madeline, he said quietly. She couldn't speak for a moment, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure he must hear it. Yates, she finally managed. You came. I should have come sooner, he admitted, stepping further into the store. I wanted to. What stopped you? She asked, setting down the tin of coffee she'd been holding. He glanced around the empty store before answering. I kept telling myself you were better off without some saddle tramp complicating your life. Shouldn't that be my decision? Madeline countered, moving closer to him. A small smile touched his lips. That's what I finally realized. He hesitated. I've been offered a job. Foreman on a ranch near Spanish Fork. It's a good position, better pay than the Double Cross. That's only 10 miles from Provo, Madeline said, hope rising in her chest. Yates nodded. Close enough to visit town regularly if I had a reason to. You'd have a reason, she said softly. The bell jingled again as another customer entered. Yates stepped back, but his eyes remained on Madeline's. I'm staying at the hotel tonight, he said quietly. Having dinner at the cafe at 7 if you'd care to join me. I would, Madeline replied, aware of the impropriety but beyond caring. That evening, she told Marcus she was meeting a friend for dinner. It wasn't exactly a lie, but she didn't elaborate. Dressed in her best blue dress, she walked to the cafe with butterflies in her stomach. Yates was waiting outside, looking uncomfortable but handsome in clean clothes, his dark hair still damp from washing. When he saw her, his face lit up in a way that made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the territory. Dinner was both wonderful and awkward. They were conscious of curious glances from other diners. Madeline Nash, dining with an unknown cowboy, was bound to set tongues wagging. But as the meal progressed, they relaxed into the easy rapport they'd established during their days in the line shack. Yates told her about the new job, his plans to eventually save enough to buy his own small spread. Madeline shared her brother's suggestion about visiting Denver, which Yates encouraged. "You should see more of the world," he said. "Like you wanted to." "I'm not sure Denver is what I had in mind," she admitted. After dinner, Yates walked her home, both of them prolonging the journey with a leisurely pace. Under the cover of darkness, he reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "When do you start your new job?" she asked. "Next week," he replied. "I've given notice at the Double Cross. Will you come back to Provo?" After you're settled, Yates stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight. "Do you want me to?" "Yes," Madeline said simply. Something in his expression shifted, a decision being made. "Madeline, I know I'm not the kind of man your family probably expects for you. I don't have much to offer except hard work and yourself," she interrupted. "That's more than enough." For a moment they stood suspended in possibility. Then Yates leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both gentle and filled with promise. Madeline's hands moved to his shoulders as she returned the kiss, feeling as though something essential had clicked into place. When they finally parted, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since that first night in the cabin," he confessed. "I'm glad you waited," Madeline smiled. "But not too glad." He laughed softly, then grew serious again. "I should speak to your brother, do things properly." The thought of Marcus's reaction gave Madeline pause, but she nodded. "Yes, but give me a little time to prepare him first." "I'm not going anywhere," Yates assured her. "Except to Spanish Fork, but that's not so far." They continued to her house, reluctantly parting at the gate with a promise to write until Yates could return to Provo. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Madeline confided in Sophia first, who was surprisingly supportive. "I thought there might be something between you and that handsome cowboy," her sister-in-law admitted. "The way you looked at each other at dinner that night, well, it reminded me of how Marcus and I were at the beginning." With Sophia's backing, approaching Marcus was less daunting. He was initially skeptical, concerned about Yates's background, his prospects, the hasty nature of their attachment. "You barely know him, Maddie," he argued. "A few days in a line shack during a dust storm, one dinner in town, that's not enough to build a life on." "It was enough to know I want the chance to build more," Madeline countered. "I'm not asking for your blessing to marry him tomorrow, just the opportunity to court properly." Marcus eventually relented, though he insisted on speaking with Yates himself before giving his approval for formal courtship. Yates's letters came regularly from Spanish Fork. His handwriting was careful but unpracticed, his expressions direct and unembellished. Yet Madeline found more poetry in his simple accounts of his days than in any verse she'd ever read. He was settling into his new position, earning the respect of the hands he supervised, making plans for the future. 2 months after their dinner in Provo, Yates returned as promised. He met with Marcus while Madeline waited anxiously in the parlor with Sophia. The men were closeted in Marcus's study for over an hour before they emerged, both looking solemn but satisfied. "Your young man has my permission to call on you," Marcus informed Madeline. "Though I've made it clear that I expect a lengthy courtship before any talk of marriage." Madeline could have hugged him and did, much to her brother's embarrassment. Yates watched with a mixture of amusement and relief. The courtship that followed was conventional in its outward forms but extraordinary in its intensity. Yates rode to Provo whenever his duties at the ranch allowed, sometimes staying for just a few hours, sometimes for a weekend. They attended church together, went on picnics chaperoned by Sophia or other friends, and gradually became a recognized couple in the community. The gossip that had initially swirled around them, the respectable Miss Nash and her cowboy suitor, eventually subsided as people came to know Yates and recognize his steadfast character. Even Marcus grew to appreciate his future brother-in-law's practical knowledge of ranching and straightforward approach to life. Privately, in the moments they could steal alone, their connection deepened. Each reunion was sweeter for the separation that preceded it. Each parting easier for the certainty that they would soon be together again. 6 months into their courtship, Yates arrived in Provo with news. "I've been offered a partnership," he told Madeline as they walked by the river, Sophia following at a discreet distance. "The owner of the ranch is getting older, has no sons. He wants someone to take over gradually, someone who knows the business and cares about the land." "Yates, that's wonderful," Madeline exclaimed. "A partnership is even better than being foreman." He nodded, his expression serious. "It means I can offer you a real future now, a home, security." He stopped walking, taking both her hands in his. "Madeline Nash, I love you. I have since that dust storm brought you into my life. Will you marry me?" Though she'd been expecting the question, had dreamed of this moment, Madeline still found herself overwhelmed with emotion. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Yates Vickers." He kissed her then, heedless of Sophia's presence, and Madeline kissed him back with all the love that had grown in her heart since that desperate day on the plains. The engagement was officially announced the following Sunday in church. Sophia threw herself into planning a June wedding, just 3 months away. Madeline found herself swept up in preparations: her dress, the flowers, the guest list, the 100 details that suddenly seemed so important. Through it all, Yates remained her anchor, solid and unchanging in his devotion. When the pressures of wedding preparations became too much, she would remember those days in the line shack, just the two of them, surviving together, learning each other's hearts in the simplest of circumstances. On a warm Saturday in June 1874, Madeline Nash became Mrs. Yates Vickers in the Provo Tabernacle, surrounded by family, friends, and well-wishers. She wore a gown of cream satin with lace that Sophia had helped her sew, and carried wildflowers gathered from the meadows where she had once been lost. Yates, standing tall and handsome in a new suit, looked at her with such love as she walked down the aisle that Madeline felt her heart might burst with happiness. When they spoke their vows, his voice was steady and sure, as it had been that day when he'd found her in the dust and offered his water to a stranger. The celebration afterward was joyous music and dancing, food and laughter. Even Marcus was seen to wipe away a tear as he toasted the newlyweds. But for Madeline and Yates, the best moment came when they finally departed for their new home, a comfortable house on the ranch where Yates was now partner. As their wagon rolled away from Provo, Madeline looked back at the town that had been her whole world for so long. Then she turned to her husband, taking his hand in hers. "Ready for the next adventure?" Yates asked, smiling down at her. "With you?" "Always," she replied, and meant it with all her heart. Their life together unfolded like the Utah landscape, before them vast and challenging, but beautiful in its possibilities. The ranch prospered under Yates's management. And within 2 years, he became full owner when his elderly partner decided to retire to Salt Lake City. Madeline proved to be not just a wife but a true partner. She kept the books as she had for her brother, but also learned about cattle breeding, weather patterns, and the complex ecosystem of a working ranch. The hands respected her almost as much as they did Yates himself. Their first child, a son they named William, was born in the spring of 1876. Holding him in her arms with Yates looking on in wonder, Madeline marveled at how a chance encounter in a dust storm had led to such profound happiness. "He has your eyes," Yates said softly, touching his son's tiny hand. "And your stubborn chin," Madeline teased. Poor child. Their family grew in the years that followed, a daughter, Catherine, in 1878, and another son, James, in 1881. The ranch grew too, as Yates's careful management and forward-thinking approaches yielded results. They added acreage, improved their stock, and built a larger home to accommodate their expanding family. Through it all, they never forgot how they had met. Each year on the anniversary of the dust storm, Yates would present Madeline with a canteen filled with clear, sweet water, a reminder of that first act of kindness that had changed both their lives. "Best water I ever tasted," she would say, sipping from it. "Best decision I ever made," he would reply, riding out to check those fence lines that day. As their children grew old enough to understand, the story of the dust storm became family legend, told and retold around the fireplace on winter evenings. William, especially, never tired of hearing how his father had rescued his mother. "Were you scared, Mama?" he would ask. "Terrified," Madeline would admit. "Until I saw your father riding toward me through the dust. Then somehow I knew everything would be all right." Life wasn't always easy. There were hard years when drought threatened the cattle, harsh winters that claimed too many calves, and the ordinary sorrows that touch every family. When Catherine fell ill with scarlet fever at age 6, Madeline and Yates spent sleepless nights by her bedside, praying for her recovery. When a fall from a horse left Yates with a broken leg that took months to heal, Madeline managed the ranch operations with a competence that impressed even the most skeptical hands. Through it all, their partnership only deepened. The attraction that had sparked between them in that small line shack matured into a love that encompassed not just passion but profound respect, friendship, and trust. By the turn of the century, the Vickers Ranch was one of the most successful in Utah territory. William, now 24, had graduated from college in Denver and returned to work alongside his father, bringing new ideas and techniques. Catherine, at 22, was teaching at the local school and engaged to the town doctor's son. Young James, 19 and adventurous, was considering joining the army but hadn't yet made his final decision. On their 28th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised Madeline with a trip to San Francisco, a city neither of them had ever seen. They traveled by train, marveling at the changing landscape outside their window. "Did you ever imagine this?" Madeline asked as they watched the California coast come into view. "That day when you found me in the dust?" Yates took her hand, his fingers still strong but now marked with the signs of years of hard work. "I couldn't have imagined anything this good," he said honestly. "I just knew I couldn't leave you out there alone." Madeline leaned against his shoulder, content in a way that only comes from decades of shared life. "I've never thanked you properly, you know. For what? For the water, for finding me, for everything that came after." Yates smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "You've thanked me every day, Madeline, with this life we've built, with our children, with your love." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I'm the one who should be grateful. That dust storm was the best thing that ever happened to me." As the train pulled into San Francisco, Madeline reflected on the journey that had brought them here, not just the physical distance from that dusty plain to this coastal city, but the spiritual journey from strangers to soulmates. How strange and wonderful that a moment of desperate need had led to a lifetime of abundance. "I love you, Yates Vickers," she said simply. "And I love you, Madeline Vickers," he replied. "Now, shall we see what adventures this city has to offer?" Hand in hand, they stepped off the train, ready to face whatever came next together, as they had been since that fateful day when a cowboy found a woman in a dust storm and offered her his water, never imagining he was also offering his heart. The years continued to pass, bringing changes both expected and surprising. William married the daughter of a neighboring rancher, joining the two properties and expanding the Vickers holdings significantly. Catherine and her husband, the doctor's son who had indeed become a doctor himself, settled in Provo but visited often with their 3 children. James did join the army briefly, serving during the Spanish-American War, but returned to Utah afterward to attend the university and study engineering. Madeline and Yates watched their family grow with pride and a sense of wonder. Grandchildren gathered around them during holidays, clamoring for stories of the old days, especially the dust storm tale, which had become almost mythic in family lore. "Grandpa, tell us again how you saved Grandma," 7-year-old Lucy, Catherine's middle child, would beg, and Yates would oblige, though he always downplayed his role. "I just happened to be in the right place at the right time," he'd say. "It was your grandmother who was brave enough to keep going when many would have given up." "And then you fell in love," Lucy would sigh romantically. "Not right away," Madeline would correct with a smile. "First, we had to shelter together in a tiny cabin while the storm raged. We played cards and talked and learned that sometimes the best people come into your life when you least expect them." By 1915, both Madeline and Yates had reached their mid-60s. The ranch was primarily run by William now, though Yates still rode out most days to check on things. Madeline had developed a reputation throughout the region for her gardens, which produced not just vegetables for the table but medicinal herbs. She used to treat various ailments among family and ranch hands alike. They had weathered the changes of the new century with a mixture of adaptation and adherence to the values that had guided their lives together. Automobiles now sat beside horses in the ranch stables. Electric lights illuminated the house that had once been lit by oil lamps. A telephone connected them to town and to their children's homes. Yet some things remained constant: their love for the land, their dedication to each other, the strength they drew from the family they had created. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson, Yates took Madeline's hand, his touch as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "You remember," he asked, "what you said to me that first night in the line shack? When you thanked me for the water?" Madeline smiled at the memory. "I said not everyone would have shared their water when they didn't know how long they'd be stranded." Yates nodded. "I've thought about that often over the years, how the smallest acts of kindness can change everything." He gazed out at the ranch lands spreading before them. "If I hadn't offered you that water, if I'd just pointed you toward town and ridden on, none of this would exist. Not our marriage, not our children or grandchildren, not this life we've built." "Some things are meant to be," Madeline said softly. "I believe we would have found each other somehow, even without the dust storm." "Maybe," Yates conceded, "but I'm grateful we didn't have to test that theory." He squeezed her hand. 41 years, Madeline. 41 years since I found you in that dust, and I've never once regretted a day of them." "Nor have I," she replied, leaning against his shoulder. "Even the hard days were better because we faced them together." They sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear. The sounds of the ranch settling for the night surrounded them, distant lowing of cattle, the soft whicker of horses in the barn, the call of a night bird from the cottonwoods by the creek. "It's a good life we've made," Yates said finally. "The best," Madeline agreed. "And there's still more to come." Indeed, there was. More grandchildren would join the family. They would celebrate 50 years of marriage surrounded by 3 generations of descendants. They would see automobiles become commonplace, witness the Great War from afar, and marvel at reports of airplanes crossing the Atlantic. Through it all, they remained each other's constant, the cowboy who had once shared his water with a stranger, and the woman who had found her true path in a dust storm. Their story, begun in a moment of crisis on the Utah plains, continued to unfold in ways neither could have imagined on that fateful day when the wind brought them together and changed both their lives forever. And each year, on the anniversary of the dust storm, Yates would still present Madeline with a canteen of clear, sweet water, a reminder that love, like water in the desert, is the most precious gift one person can offer another.